Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest Solarpunk Presents bonus chat, in which Ariel and I dissect the Solarpunk short story, The Year Without Sunshine. Before we begin, let me make the usual plea for your support, so join our Patreon, subscribe to our YouTube, and click like on the videos. It is now, as we're recording it, it's the first week of July, and the winners of the 59th annual Nebula Awards were announced in early June of 2024. And there was a Solarpunk winner. So Naomi Kritzer, a writer from St. Paul, Minnesota, won the Nebula Award for Best Novelette with her story, The Year Without Sunshine, which was published in Uncanny Magazine and is freely available to read at www.uncannymagazine.com, or check out the more specific link in the description for this episode.
In the story, we'll give you a brief overview just before we dive into talking about it. So sorry, but this chat is very full of spoilers. Please, if you haven't read the story, just put this on pause and go read the story for free at uncannymagazine.com. In short, the skies go dusty and the regular workings of society, like a steady electricity supply, the availability of food, and telecommunications, they all go down. The Year Without Sunshine is about how a group of neighbors band together to find what they need, grow what they need to grow, and hack what they need to hack in order to make it through that time of darkness. And this comes to include generating the electricity needed to keep an elderly neighbor's oxygen concentrator going so that she literally does not die. At the same time, they weather an attack from outsiders, which is a more expected post-apocalyptic story beat. But then by the end of the story, one of the would-be attackers, a teenager, comes back to their neighborhood of his own volition, and he wants to join them, which is a little bit more unexpected.
To me, this feels like the utter epitome of a Solarpunk story. I mean, except for the, oh, oops, the sun went out aspect of it, right? Because you've got all these neighbors who form a community, they pool their resources and skills, instead of resorting to the survivalist narrative of the patriarch retreating into a compound and protecting his family with guns. And people are mostly decent to each other. So when the main character, Alexis, goes up to the house of the people with the generator, that could have been a totally staring down the barrel of a shotgun, get off my property kind of moment, right? Which is exactly what I was expecting. I was expecting the story to go that way. And yet, this old white guy turns out to be exactly the opposite of threatening, so totally subverting your expectations. And everyone tries to volunteer their skills and their peddling power to solve the problem he has, which is how he's going to keep his wife alive without electricity. So they need electricity to run her oxygen concentrator because she's got COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And basically your lungs are shot and you need a lot of oxygen.
I like the touch about the peddling power and getting everybody to pedal together, because I think that's just such a great idea. But in the short term, they need a lot of propane.
Right, because then they can power a generator to provide electricity for the oxygen concentrator. So this is the other thing they all kind of pool their resources to do, is they go out and get people to give them propane canisters. And people seem to be willing to do that despite the fact that there's a very unreliable electricity supply, and presumably people like to do things like cook. So the other way, this is the epitome of a Solarpunk story, is that the characters in it are totally sort of like hacker/maker people, right? They rigged up these bikes to generate electricity. They set up a wind turbine to generate electricity. They figure out how to grow potatoes in their backyard under less than ideal conditions, right? It's dark. There's not much in the way of sunlight. They set up a root cellar. Okay, some of this stuff is, what people used to do in the past, but, these are all things that are also very Solarpunk. Just to keep going through this list of ways in which I thought this story was totally Solarpunk, violence does not solve any problems.
Yeah, like there's even a conversation in the story where they make the decision consciously to not solve problems with deadly force and not to deal with any trespasses or anything with deadly force, to always try and, like they're not going to be soft, but they're not going to try and kill people either.
They didn't even really want to shoot the deer that were getting into the garden and eating things. Even though deer are edible.
Yeah,
Um,
that was I was wondering like are they vegetarian or vegan or like, like do they have a broader conception of animal rights? Like what is the reason behind not wanting maybe they just don't want a gun going off so close to houses where it could possibly, like hit a child or something like that.
yeah, that was the kind of vibe I got from the
Mhm.
story. But I mean, because society hasn't completely broken down, and there are still some rules here, and you just don't want to start shooting in the city, right? So,
That's fair.
and you also don't want to get in trouble with other people for shooting, right? Because violence somehow begets violence. And so you just don't want to go there, even when the deer are eating, your peas and beans, or I forget what it was that they were
Mm.
eating.
The
But
bees, I believe.
at the same time, these people are not pushovers, right? If they have to stand up and defend themselves, they defend themselves. And if they need to go solve a problem, they go solve a problem. And they are not afraid to face what they need to face to do that.
Mhm.
That to me is how this story is totally the epitome of a solar punk story. I don't know if you have any further observations on what makes this a solar punk story.
You covered most of it. I think that what's really important is the kindness that causes their community to grow. It causes that one boy who attacked them in the attack, which was, totally subverted by the fact that it was just a bunch of unorganized teenagers who decided of their own volition to go and attack this place. And their parents were actually quite angry at them
Well, I don't
for
think they were trying to attack. I think they were trying to sneak in and steal some vegetables
Yeah,
or
I'm using attack in a sort of broad sense.
anyways,
Yeah,
they weren't expecting the community to defend itself from some sort of invasion.
exactly, exactly. And I mean, they had two hostages after the attack, and so these hostage teenagers got shown around the compound and they were like, maybe you can take some of these ideas back to your own hope community. Like the people there are very generous and not afraid of, like the teenagers like stealing their secrets or whatever, because there are no secrets, right?
So I think hostages is kind of a strong term. Detainees might be a better
Mm,
term.
detainees, I don't know. It sort of has a weird ring to it for me as a, post 9/11
Yeah, okay.
adult. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, the teenagers who were not part of their community got welcomed into the community. Well, they both do eventually go back, but then one of them returns a couple of months later and explicitly says that he does want to be a part of the community, which I
Yeah,
think
and
is,
offers his services and tries to be good enough to be a part of the
yeah.
community. Yeah, so that was a nice end to the story, I thought.
And it really shows that like a community, yeah, sure, it's, like a community of people who happen to be in the same place, but it's not like that community is exclusive. It's not like it's like we don't see any evidence of anyone in the community saying, well, he's not from around here, so he shouldn't be part of this community. There's none of that weirdness going on.
So one thing that's really interesting about this story is how interesting it is. When really it's just sort of like this happens and then this happens and then this happens and this happens. Like there really is
Mhm.
only one goal. I mean, I guess sort of kind of two goals that the protagonists have, and one is to just survive this whole incident with the
Uh-huh.
sun dimming because the sky is really dusty, and that kind of throws civilization offline, a semi offline. And the other is to keep this woman alive by generating power for her. And yet, and so there aren't, okay, so those teenagers kind of show up towards the very end and try to steal stuff. Aside from that, there aren't really fights between people. You're really
Mm-mm.
just watching how people get it together to work together and how they solve the problems that come up. And, problem after problem after problem comes up. And it's really compelling.
To me, it kind of rings true, honestly. There was that one point in the story where there's a person who dissents who says, well, I don't know if we should, be doing all this for that one woman with COPD because, like we're just delaying the inevitable or whatever. But they're just sort of a grumbling voice of dissent. They don't actually do anything. It's not like there is armed mutiny or rebellion within the ranks or anything like that, like nothing quite so dramatic, which also bears out for me with human nature because I mean, the doers will get things done, and the people who like to criticize are just going to sit around and criticize, and they're not actually going to, mount an armed rebellion.
So we talked about this a little bit in the panel at the Solarpunk conference, talked about this story a little bit, and also about conflict. I mean, the panel was about conflict in Solarpunk stories, and how actually this kind of conflict that doesn't involve actual conflict between people is actually really, really interesting. We've just forgotten that there's all sorts of conflict in stories, and so there's not really any problem with having conflict in Solarpunk stories, even the ones that aren't dealing with major environmental catastrophes, just because life happens and there's problems that need to be solved.
Yeah, there's enough problems around just sort of naturally without having to create problems, like artificially induce drama, basically.
Yeah, like space aliens coming in and stealing a time machine, or I don't know, any of all this kind of stuff. So,
Yeah,
like I said,
which
I
those are
was,
fun stories, by the way. Those are fun stories, but
and yet
just saying.
this was also a fun story.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it.
Obviously, the writer, I've already forgotten her name because I'm such a bad person, Naomi Kritzer. She obviously did a very, very good job writing the story.
Yeah,
Um,
it's very compelling because you want to know what happened. Like, do these people survive? Like what happens to these characters? It's very, you get pulled along by just wanting to know more about what's going on, right? And because the situation is both so sort of normal to us, we like it's so familiar at the same time as it's so strange to us.
Weirdly, it's kind of like a solar punk apocalypse story.
There's a genre called the cozy apocalypse. People will
Aren't
say
they
it's
kind of all right? Sort of.
well, people have said it's sort of risen in the past little while, but actually it goes all the way back to John Wyndham's Day of the Triffids was in like the 1950s or something like that. Anyways, it follows a guy who, wakes up after some sort of apocalypse and then just has to,
Yeah, yeah.
find other people and live,
There
you
was
know?
I think it was a comet or some sort of asteroid meteor
Oh
shower, right?
yeah,
But he had
yeah.
like eye surgery, or for some reason his eyes had been bandaged, so he didn't see it.
Yeah, yeah. And he wakes up in the hospital and he takes off his eye bandages and then has to just find people and survive, right? And so that's the premise of the cozy apocalypse is
Oh no,
that
wait,
it's
I'm
like,
getting it confused with another story.
no, 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 that's right. That's
Is
right.
it? But don't people end up planting these triffids? I've got it confused with another story. Hang on. Hello, Google. I
Yeah,
made
I
it.
don't think there are people who are planting the triffids in the
Yeah, they
original
are.
Day
They
of the
are. They
Triffids.
are.
Before the whole apocalypse, they're using them as a source of oil, like a natural source of oil. And so they are deliberately encouraging these triffid plantations. The triffids are genetically modified organisms. We're getting a little bit off the topic
Yeah,
here.
so it's 1951. So the protagonist is a biologist who worked with triffids, which are tall, venomous, carnivorous plants capable of locomotion. I mean, like, who designed that? He suspects they were bioengineered in the Soviet Union and accidentally released into the wild. And you're right, because of the excellent industrial quality of oil. Sorry, I'm just quoting Wikipedia here. Produced by the triffids, there's a lot of triffid cultivation around the world. So it does begin with Bill in the hospital, his eyes bandaged up because he got splashed with triffid poison.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was this meteor shower that
Yep.
happened that he didn't see because his eyes were bandaged up.
So it's an interesting apocalypse in
Ah,
that it
right, the
both
light.
involves like
The
GMOs or whatever, like it's a human caused, issue of the triffids, but they're not actually a problem until there's this strange meteor shower, right?
and
So
then everyone goes blind, anyone who watched it.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so then they become prey for the triffids because they can't see anything.
mm-hmm.
And then
Yes,
it's very solar punk. Then they then they have to they the survivors have to join a colony together and help each other, both sighted and unsighted people or now blind people, in order to survive
yep.
the takeover by the Triffids.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
very much the cozy apocalypse because it's people basically just helping each other, people who through no fault of their own have become disabled and need that human connection. And so that human connection is fostered in order to survive this dangerous situation. And so there are a lot of stories out there which are called these cozy apocalypses, which is kind of like a slice of life almost of just on the small scale of a group of people who are just doing their best to survive this terrible outcome. They're not scientists or engineers or politicians or like anybody in charge of what happened. So they don't actually know what really happened. They try to put the pieces together, but because they don't really know how something happened, they don't know how to fix it either. So it's just kind of a situation that they have to survive.
Okay, you're the sci-fi expert here, not me. I just read it from time to time, occasionally watch a movie. My understanding of a cozy apocalypse was one in which all these people have just conveniently died and we aren't exposed to the trauma of that and the horror of, most of the human race kicking the bucket.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it because it is so slice of life and so just focused on a small group of people. I mean, there might be like a throwaway, oh, this is how horrible this all happened, but the characters never really have to deal with it so much. Like, even in this story, I mean, who knows what's happening in hospitals when the power goes out,
All
Who
right, so now
knows?
now we're back to The Year Without Sunshine.
Yeah, sorry. The Year Without Sunshine. I mean, like if you're taking more of a macro view, I mean, what's happening if someone is in the middle of surgery, like a life-saving surgery, and the power goes out, and this is 3 months in, and they're running out of gas for the generator, like what happens then, right? This has a potential to be a lot more terrible and horror filled than it actually is. But instead of taking the horror angle, this writer has chosen to focus on the things that bring people together and the ways in which things can be made better.
I mean, she kind of alludes to these macro problems, like, they're running out of insulin and running out of psychiatric medications and
Yep.
I'm blanking on it, but there's an incident where one of the people has to go and help with some emergency response and is gone for a couple of days and she has to like feed their cat or something like that.
It was a power plant. The guy who works at the power plant.
Okay, okay.
Yeah. And
And
he was like, if I don't come back, like make sure that my cat is fed, right? Which is a very grim thing, right? But the story doesn't dwell on it, like it has the potential. If this were a different genre of story, we could follow that guy and we could think about his anxieties. If this were a different genre of story, we could follow the character in the community who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia and what happens to him when he can't get access to his medications and stuff like that. I think that the way that Naomi Kritzer has chosen to focus this really sort of lends to the solarpunk genre-ness of it.
And then the last point about how this story is Solarpunk is that in the end, their community grows because of kindness, right? Because that teenager that they've been kind to, even though he was kind of a jerk to them because he didn't know better, because he was a stupid teenager, he joins their community. And that is very, very, very Solarpunk.
I mean, it emphasizes that like found family aspect too, like these are your or chosen family, honestly. Like these are the people that you choose to be around. He clearly left his parents, his neighborhood, what he's probably known since growing up, and chose to leave all of that behind and come to this community that the story is focused on because it is a place where I forget the exact quote, but it's where people care about each other. And that is what has really impressed him. And he really wants to be a part of that.
Okay, now before I move on to my gripe with this story, I just want to say
Mhm.
you should definitely read Day of the Triffids because it's a super fun book. I think they even made a movie out of it.
They did a schlocky sort of like 1950s or 1960s horror film. I don't know. I haven't watched it.
Okay, I'll have to
It's
check it out.
certainly it's a thing that exists.
Okay. I mean, it can't be, I just watched Under Paris, which is about Mako sharks taking over Paris, which is on
Ooh,
Netflix
that's
right now. It was
interesting.
talk about schlock. I mean, it's well done and like the actors can act and the dialogue is actually all right, but then at the end it jumps the shark, shall we say. It's totally if you just need 2 hours of fun. Yeah. Anyways, my gripe with the story is what is up with not having the disaster that is the foundation of the story here not be climate change?
The only nod to it in the story was that terrible storm that comes through, like it
You'll
is
get
part of,
terrible storms in that part of the world.
isn't Minnesota like tornado country?
Short answer, yes, it is a part of Tornado Alley.
I don't really know what the weather's like there, right? But it seems
Blizzards in winter. Can they get hit by nor'easters or are they too far west for that?
even here, like this summer, where I am in southern Ontario,
Which is slightly north and a bit further east than Minnesota.
we've been having some pretty violent storms pretty much every week. Climate change is becoming an issue. I mean, there's rumors of drought and stuff like that, and that's not in the story either, which is interesting given that they're doing sort of farming and yeah,
But
anyways.
you can only cover so much in, in a novelette, right? So
That's true.
and
Yeah, that's true.
a
I
novelette.
mean, she
It's
probably
a
didn't.
relatively short, it's not a short story, but it's a short story. I mean, I think novelette's kind of pushing it
Yeah,
a bit.
yeah. I'd say you could read it in about 20 minutes. It's not exactly
Yeah. But anyway, so this
gigantic.
disaster, that's the whole point of the story or the whole reason for the story is really vague. It's just, things get dusty, the sky is full of ash. They never say a word like climate change in there. And really, when you think about it, it seems to be modeled after The Year Without a Summer. I mean, because it's also so very close to the title, The Year Without Sunshine. And this was a real thing that happened in 1816. That was caused by the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. And so this caused sort of nuclear winter conditions, so to speak. I don't know if any of you are old enough to know what nuclear winter is, but you end up with all this dust high up in the sky, so like in the stratosphere, so it's not going to rain out. And it just spends a couple of years. Also, you have a lot of sulfate particles, which also kind of help dim the planet. So you've got this dust and these sulfate particles dimming the sunshine, not letting it through. And so global temperatures go down by a degree or two, and there's less sunlight, and you tend to get things like famines because crops fail. Not because there's no sunlight, it's just because it's really cold, unseasonably cold. Snow
Mm.
falls in the middle of summer and stuff like that. And as I said, there was this year without a summer in 1816. Now, in the United States, this was experienced as, and I'm just quoting from Wikipedia here, a persistent dry fog that dimmed the sunlight, causing unusual cold and frost throughout the summer months. And crops failed in places like New England, and there were a few food shortages and economic distress and riots, and people went hungry, and so on and so forth. So this sounds an awful lot like what they're facing in this short story. So it's climate change that the characters are having to deal with. But the author has chosen an event that is not human-induced climate change. And I'm really scratching my head about that choice. Is that what we need right now?
This makes me think of how when people talk about geoengineering with, like solar shielding and stuff, I'm like, think about the year without a summer.
Oh, yeah, no. So, I mean, they are talking about shooting off sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere where they would remain for a year or two. And yeah, exactly. The whole point of that is to dim the sunshine by, I don't know, I'd have to look it up, but on the order of 1% or so in order to cool global temperatures. And that's the sort of thing that can go really haywire if you do it wrong. And then you're stuck with the results for 2 or 3 years. But also if you want to, maintain the cooling, then you have to keep doing it. There's talk of like putting up high altitude balloons that sort of pump out these aerosols, and do it continuously. It's relatively low cost. The other problem with it is that you would have to continuously do it, otherwise you end up with this horrible rebound effect with global warming. This is known as termination shock. And what's happening is because you've had this dimming of the sunshine that has cooled the planet, you haven't dealt with the higher greenhouse gas concentrations. So the minute you stop putting in these aerosols and the sunlight goes back to its normal strength, then you rapidly return to the climate temperature that you would have because of the increased greenhouse effect. And if you've been not preparing for it because you assume that you're going to have this cooler climate, then this is the termination shock. You're in a worse position than you would be if you had stuck with the global warming and dealt with it.
I didn't know about that rebound effect. I just have nightmare visions of that train that goes through a snow piercer. There we go.
Right. Well, so yeah, I mean, you'd have to seriously mess it up to do something like that. And as I said, these sulfate aerosols, they don't last forever. They only last a couple years. So
Oh
unless,
yeah, yeah. I think Snowpiercer is to solar radiation management as Jurassic Park is to like GMOs.
okay,
It
yeah.
does have the potential to go catastrophically wrong in, like a way similar to that, but it's probably not gonna, be as sensational as it's depicted. At the same time, perhaps people should think about it.
Well, this is the thing that frustrates me about a lot of these stories is that they go for the most over the top bad thing that could happen multiplied by 1,000, rather than actually picking apart the bad things that could happen and would be more likely to happen and also have severe repercussions, but just aren't quite so visually dramatic. And I
Fair.
just, but maybe you just need a level of technical expertise to actually know what these things are. I don't know. I don't know what the problem is. Or maybe people just like the drama and they think gotta have a dramatic story, otherwise people won't go for it. Or it won't be science
Yeah.
fiction, or I don't know what it is. But
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
so
coming
so
back to The Year Without a Summer,
I
though, like
could say
I'm like
just say
I'm
it,
not saying that
just say
there needs to
it,
be a
just say it, climate change.
I'm not saying that there needs to be like a meteorologist or climate scientist character, but even just, like people having a discussion about it or curiosity about, like what actually happened. Nobody's curious. Everybody seems to just take it in stride. Like, okay, this is a thing now. And I think that, like that would have lent this more credence because humans are naturally curious and we like to know the origins of phenomena, as it can also give us clues to the future or how that phenomenon will end. And it
Totally.
just seems odd that not even once was there a mention of curiosity about what had happened. I don't know. I feel like, yeah, it
Even
has to be a
just
short story, but like
Oh,
even
even
just
just a
throwaway line.
sentence. Yeah.
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 Like one of the, like something from one of the kids, even, like what happened, like kids are super curious, like I just it
You know
bothered
what?
me.
They don't, I think people don't want to alienate part of the audience. So it's like with Interstellar, which was this huge science fiction film, I guess about 8 years ago now, moved the entire human race off of an angry, dusty Earth without ever once insinuating that what happened was climate change. Instead, it was just the Earth was pissed off and got dusty, and the Earth wouldn't let anything but corn grow. So people had to eat corn, by which I mean maize or sweet corn for the rest of you people in the non-American speaking world who think that corn also means wheat and stuff like that. That's my, yeah. I mean, aside from, okay, I have two gripes with Interstellar, and I probably bitched about this before. One is like, I'm sorry, but love is not the next fundamental force in the universe, right next to gravity and the nuclear force and all that kind of stuff. And gosh, why can't it be climate change?
Not having it be climate change as a result, it sort of feels like the story is set in like an alternate present and not an actual near future. Like
Well,
maybe that's
so
what the
I guess
author was going for, but like again, something like Interstellar or any movie that doesn't really acknowledge climate change as the reason, even a contributing factor to how the characters act at this point. Like it doesn't have to be about climate change, but climate change does need to be acknowledged as just a reality in the world, I would assume.
yeah,
But
but both Interstellar and The Year Without Sunshine are absolutely about climate change. That is like central to the stories and the plots and everything and the settings, everything about both of these. And
yeah,
yet nobody wants to go there, even though they've gone there. So this is my
yeah, they've managed to go there without going there. And I understand your gripe, Christina. Maybe I'm not quite as passionate about it, but I do understand your gripe.
It is one of my pet peeves. Another thing about this story is I think the story also pretty accurately captures the American habit of helping one's own people, but circling the wagons against others. In some sense, even though it's very solar punk, it's also very insular.
I think what makes it Solarpunk is just the values of like sort of kindness and care within the community. Care for Susan, the old woman on the oxygen machine. That's what sort of catalyzes the entire neighborhood and actually is sort of the reason to bring the neighborhood together. And that's kind of the catalyst for the story, to be honest. And Jack, who's the teen who broke his ankle in sort of that failed raid, he comes to join them at the end specifically because he wants to be part of a community where people care about each other. So it seems insular, I would say, but I don't think it acts insular.
That's just a weird comment from me. Maybe it doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
But
Well,
no, I get where you're coming from because it totally does, like it does seem like that whole what you said, like circling the wagons against others kind of thing, like this, it seems like they're assuming that other people will be hostile. They're not, but it's proven through the story that other neighborhoods are more hostile than they are.
it's a weird thing to think about, isn't it? If you think about where you're living now and you think about, what if, so I think about this a lot lately
Hmm.
because what if we're at war in another year or two and, everything goes down and you got to get through and survive some period of time without outside support. And we've got farmers up the street and would they feed us? Mm, it's not clear to me. Would they help us? We would help them. I'm not sure what we could offer them, I don't know. And so, your mind goes through this and you think about all your different neighbors and you just think about who would be on your side and who wouldn't be on your side and who would help you and who wouldn't help you. And yeah, I'm sure it's everybody thinks about this kind of stuff from time to time.
Yeah, and I think this story, though, subverts that because Susan expressly does not have something to give to the community besides, like being an amazing, cheerful presence, being kind and teaching the kids how to knit and stuff like that. When the outsider teens come in, they ask, why are you keeping her alive? Is she a doctor or a medic or
Yeah, but
something like
that was
that?
kind of
And
weird, because I don't think
but
it's really that much of a stretch to want to keep somebody alive just because they're alive, because they're a human being. I mean, come on.
I mean, you'd be surprised.
Okay, I would be surprised because I don't think and I have a very low opinion of the human race. I don't really think people are jerks on that level.
I think it's more speaking to a genre expectation because Susan and people like Susan are not even factors in most post-apocalyptic stories. Susan and people like Susan, oh, how horrible. It is too bad for those people. But we're going to focus on the able-bodied people who can generate an interesting story, basically.
Oh yeah, but that doesn't mean you just let these people die in real life.
Well, yes.
There was a paper that just came out because they found a Neanderthal skeleton of a child who was like 7 or 8 years old, so well past being breastfed, and it had I can't remember if it was a he or a she, but anyways, had
They
Down
don't, I,
syndrome.
I don't think they know. And I did read that article and it's
And so they're
amazing.
like, see, look, see, even the Neanderthals, however many tens of thousands of years ago, they were already had this altruistic thing that we do, right? And you see it back through time in the human fossil record that we do keep people alive who, in those particular circumstances, would be unable to survive on their own. It's what we do. That's the whole. I mean, that's also the root of community. That's what communities do. They're not heartless.
Mhm.
We're not heartless. We can be jerks. We can circle the wagons, but that doesn't mean we're 100% heartless.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's possible for communities to exist that don't actually care about each other, that are just instrumentalists, that do just only value you for what you can contribute to the community. And if you can't contribute, then that's too bad. You're
Oh,
not
but
going to be, like
who would want to
helped or
belong to a
supported.
community like that, though? I mean,
I'm
that's
just saying that those
horrid.
things, those communities do happen.
That's merciless.
It is merciless, but there are communities of, say, neo-Nazis and communities of, say, people who are on the alt-right who do think like that. There are certain categories of people who they think do not bring any value to a
Right.
community.
They apply
And
that to
so,
strangers? Do they
yes,
apply that to people who they identify as being their own?
honestly, I have no idea because I'm not part of any of those communities. So
Yeah, okay. I actually think it's kind of weird that this story won a Nebula.
tell
It's a
me.
great story. It's super compelling. It's super
Hmm.
interesting. I love the story. I could read it a dozen times.
Hmm.
It's a solar punk story, but is it even science fiction? Is
Mm.
it even speculative fiction? Well, I don't understand what speculative fiction means, but don't even tell me that it's cli-fi when it couldn't even say the words climate change. As long as I'm having this little rant, most of the grist stories, which are all also super, they are also not science fiction.
Hmm.
So is solar punk science fiction? Because and also one thing I've noticed from a bunch of stories, obviously I haven't read all solar punk stories, but weirdly for something at which science is the heart of, science seems to be missing from a lot of solar punk stories, like this one, which just has this climate disaster that it doesn't name and it doesn't explain and
Hmm.
and why? Why?
Yeah. I mean, this makes me think of how one of the earliest Solarpunk anthologies on the market is Wings of Renewal, a Solarpunk dragon anthology. It's explicitly fantasy. It's not science fiction. It's like themed
But then
around
how is that even
dragons
solar punk?
because it's you know, you probably want to read the introduction about
Okay.
that. I'm sure that they would give different answers than I would. So I think that a lot of solarpunk stories do have an unacknowledged seed of fantasy to them. In order to engage with solarpunk fiction, you do have to suspend your disbelief. So I'm going to push back on you about whether it's actually speculative fiction because it does have that speculation element. You do have to think, oh, what if the world were otherwise? That is sort of the definition of speculative fiction. It doesn't really matter how, like through a scientific nova or through, magic or fantasy or something like that, but just what would happen if the world were otherwise.
So it's not science fiction necessarily.
I Not necessarily. And also, I mean, what's your definition of science, right?
Oh, we could talk about that for hours. So tell
Yeah.
me more about this suspension of disbelief that's happening in this story, this some year without sunshine.
Yeah. Well, I see it as sort of a suspension of disbelief of the belief that people are terrible to each other in a catastrophe, which is the driving belief behind a lot of post-apocalyptic stories and post-apocalyptic myths that we have. It is the base assumption. So I've talked
I
about
think
it
there have been
before.
enough wars for us to think that, sometimes people are really terrible to each other.
Sometimes, but for some reason that sometimes has become always in every situation. We've been operating for centuries under a philosophy that assumes that people will be horrible to each other the moment that the social contract, quote unquote, or the status quo of societal rules is broken or damaged in some way. So I'm directly referencing Thomas Hobbes here, but also the notion that nature is quote unquote red in tooth and claw, which is a famous quote from a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, which is handy shorthand for the assumption that the natural world is aggressive and hostile all of the time. Our episode with Jenny Kerber goes over that worldview in more depth.
Okay,
But like it's
as a
like
biologist, I gotta say, on some level, the biological world is red in tooth and claw. Everybody's eating everybody else, and hardly anybody gets through alive. That's the whole
yeah,
natural selection thing. Like 90% of everybody feeds some, actually, probably 100% on some level ends up feeding somebody else. It's just a question of how young you are when that happens.
is that a moral signifier for it being a bad thing then?
No, it is a thing. It is just a thing. It's a very efficient thing. And it's amazing because it supports the entire biodiversity that we have on Earth, what's left that human race hasn't destroyed. And there is no more efficient way to distribute, so you start off with sunlight and then the plants capture it and they use it to turn carbon dioxide into organic matter. So like carbonates, not carbonates, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, this sort of thing, biological material, the organic stuff, the soft stuff, not the hard parts, not like
Mm.
bones and shells and stuff like that. So this contains what you need to be a body and do stuff, but it also contains lots of energy and nutrients. And so you move this stuff that started off as inorganic nutrients and sunlight, and you move it through the food web because everybody's eating each other. And then you've got the recyclers and yeah, anyways, all this stuff. And there is no other way to distribute all that stuff that started out with the plants to this incredible diversity of form and function and different organisms that we have. So it's a
Yeah.
horrible thing. It's violent. It is unkind. It is merciless, and yet it has this amazingly positive impact. And I mean, so it
Mm.
is just a neutral thing. So I know my dad is always like, "What kind of God could have invented the food web? It's so mean." And yeah, it is mean, but it isn't mean. It just is. It just is, and it's a system. It's how it functions, and there's no other way it could function so effectively to support so many different life forms.
Yeah, exactly. So are you going to make that the villain in your post-apocalyptic story, knowing all of that? You know,
Me personally, no.
yeah. So it doesn't really hold up, does it?
But
And
on the other hand, if you're this little person on a boat in the middle of a hurricane, kind of holds up for you. Okay, it's
well,
not the food web, not until the sharks get you. But you're dead at that point anyways, right? But I mean, the world is full of power and energy, and sometimes it kills you and
Yeah.
mercilessly. And so from your
But
perspective, then that nature is quite red in tooth and claw at that
yeah,
point.
but is it always like that
Yeah,
to the
no, but
person
it's the whole
who's
yin yang thing, right?
yeah, exactly. So like, but basically what I'm trying to say is you can't assume that it will always be like that. You cannot see a lion just like sitting by itself in the savannah, sunning itself and being like, that is the villain of my story. I must kill it before it kills me, kind of thing. You can just walk away and let that lion just do its own thing. You know, it's not inherently evil because it is part of this food chain.
Oh yeah,
In
lions
this,
aren't evil. Lions are just lions.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. But I'm just saying that within the genre of the post-apocalyptic, it's very likely that your villain is going to be an animal or a process of nature that we understand now is it just is. It's not good or bad. But within the story, it's going to be assigned a moral label. So this story undermines all of that.
The dust just
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, the dust just is. It also, like undermines the belief that as soon as there aren't police around, people or laws, like to be enforced, people will just act selfishly and will not help each other because that is a belief to which we
I,
ascribe.
but even what is the name of those movies where they suspend, there's no rules for like 24 hours or one night
Oh,
or
the
something like that.
purge.
The Purge. But even in the Purge movies, you get people who are basically decent and good who band together to help each other, and you get people who are totally bad banding together to help each other kill more people.
I cannot talk about the purge because I have not seen it because I think it's ridiculous.
I saw one, The Purge election year, where they're targeting a presidential candidate who's campaigning to end the purge. It's the only one I've seen, and it was not as bad as I thought it would be.
I mean, it's an interesting concept. I don't think you need to have made an entire movie about it, though.
I don't think they're really examining a deep philosophy here. They're just making an entertaining movie on a premise that doesn't feel so outlandish on some level. But I'm just saying, so even in this movie, which is predicated on people being absolutely horrible if there are no rules, not everybody goes that way, even in these movies. And there is still honor among thieves.
And when we see that, though, we think of it as being something special, right? They're the protagonists. They have acted anomalously because everybody else, all the background characters, I assume, in The Purge, because I haven't seen it, are acting bananas.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Clearly.
bananas background characters, like the people who
Okay.
come from Europe for 24 hours of mayhem as tourists so that they can murder people and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a lot of like jerks in the
Interesting.
background.
Interesting. Okay, so our beliefs that humanity is at base bad, with, only a few exceptions, isn't actually true. Humanity just
Okay,
is.
I think people are jerks and I think the human race is horrible, but I don't actually think, and I think I speak for most people, that most people are inherently bad. Do most people? I mean, that's a totally Christian idea,
It is a
weirdly to
totally
me.
Christian idea.
And I guess I didn't grow up in a Christian tradition because I don't. Do Christians really think that people are inherently bad? I mean, like, do they feel that in their hearts?
I mean, there's original sin.
Yeah, yeah, intellectually, fine. But in their hearts, do Christians, just to make a broad sweeping generalization here, actually feel that people are inherently bad?
Christina, I cannot speak for all
Or,
Christians.
okay, but did you ever feel that way?
I think it's less to do with religion and more to do with the fact that I grew up in Toronto at the height of stranger danger. Everybody is potentially a predator who's going to kidnap a young girl and do horrible, terrible things to them. So
Well, it's one thing to think that there are people out there who would do that, and there's another to think that everybody might do that.
that's what I'm saying is that post-apocalyptic fiction does sort of operate on that premise is that everybody is going to be terrible
Huh.
unless perhaps you happen to be the protagonist.
I guess I have been reading the wrong books and watching the wrong movies. I mean, so I'm thinking of the Hunger Games. Plenty of good people in the Hunger Games.
Yeah. Yeah,
Oh, plenty
again,
of
that's
really
subversion.
awful people. And of course there's also, honor among thieves, and not all thieves, but some thieves.
Yeah,
And I don't mean thieves literally, but there are people who band together to fight for a better world, and there are people who have mercy for each other and who are kind to
yeah.
each other.
And I'm so glad that these kind of stories are becoming more of a like so much of a dominant norm, Christina, that you're like that can't be true. That's
But
not
so
it.
what's a post-apocalyptic story where everybody except the protagonist is awful?
You know what everybody will know about is Mad Max.
Okay, I have not actually seen a single Mad Max movie.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
I mean, there's a lot of them where people are just failures, but so I was what springs to mind, 12 Monkeys is a failed attempt to save the world from
oh
apocalypse,
yeah.
but that it's not that everybody is bad
Have you
at
seen
all.
Brazil?
Oh yeah, Brazil was a nightmare. Brazil was a total nightmare, but how much of that movie was happening in that guy's head?
I don't know. I think that's part of what the whole premise of
Oh,
the
but
movie
Brazil
is.
is
You're
like
supposed
nobody
to think
likes.
about it.
Okay, a lot of people like that film, but a lot of people don't like that film because it is just bleak.
It is very bleak, yeah, for
And
sure.
then you have all the I Am Legend movies and that
Yep.
story, and there's so many of them. But ultimately, the person who turns out to be evil is the main character who doesn't understand that he's part of what was old and bad, and that all of these, I don't know, vampires or whatever they are now, are actually good. And he
Yeah,
represents an existential threat to them. He's going around murdering them, right? So where does that fit into this? That's a really old story, right? That comes from the 60s or so.
yeah.
Actually, the original novel, I Am Legend, by Richard Matheson, was published in 1954.
And I mean, like The Walking Dead. Well, that's newer, I guess, but and I haven't watched through all of it, but that, operates on the premise that, most people are just in it to for themselves, right?
So to me, these apocalypse stories or dystopian stories or post-apocalyptic stories, there are people out there who are bad, but it's not that all people, like, or so if you look at Soylent Green, for example, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people who are just trying to survive in this really crappy system, but they're not bad people.
Mm,
So I got to push
yeah.
back on this idea that in apocalyptic fiction that all people are bad except for the protagonist. I don't see it. I don't see it.
Okay, I think that it's definitely a assumption that goes along with the genre. It's like if these people had chance, they would not be good people, you know? Like if that social contract in Soylent Green were broken and these people were, I don't know, empowered to, I don't know, like
Wait,
not carry on with their jobs, then they would, like just act selfishly.
and yet weirdly in Soylent Green, kind of what happens is that these people actually break the laws to be nice to each other.
That's so lovely. All I know about Soylent Green is that meme.
It's people.
Yes,
Yeah, no,
exactly.
it's Soylent Green's weird because Charlton Heston was such a conservative jerk, and yet he's in all of these really liberal movies. And I think it's based on a story, I think it's by Harry Harrison. And you just don't really expect this whole there's a whole like we're gonna destroy. It's so sad that we destroyed the ecology, and now we live in this horrible world where to feed people we have to recycle old people. We have to convince old people, sorry, that's a spoiler. We have to convince old people to commit suicide so we can turn them into Soylent
I
Green
think the
people.
story is old enough at this point that like spoilers are kind of moot.
To me, a core part of this apocalyptic fiction is that you have a group of people who buck the system to be nice to each other and to fight for
I
something
mean,
better.
oh, I thought you were talking about the old people who were volunteering to become food. And I was like, I
I don't
don't
think
think
they
that's
knew. I
bucking the
don't think
system.
they knew. I don't think
I
they knew.
don't
There's
think
this scene
that's
where Charlton Heston has to ride on this like garbage truck that's taking the body of his friend to be processed or whatever, and then he ends up in the factory, and that then he discovers all these bodies are being like chucked into the Soylent Green vats or
oh,
whatever, and that's when he's like, "It's people."
yeah.
You have
Ah,
to see it. It's a classic.
okay. Well, I will put that on the list, I suppose.
So none of these movies are Solarpunk. So we've gotten way, way, way off.
But basically, instead of like a minority of people doing the right thing, in this story, in Solarpunk stories, there is a majority of people doing the right thing. And so the people who are not doing the right thing are the outliers, at least from our point of view in the story, you know? We're following this group of people, and the people that we see dissenting are and being jerks are like far less than the amount of people who are collaborating to be helpful and, you know, contribute to this community.
Right. There's no need to fight against tyranny because tyranny hasn't set itself up yet.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Like, and when tyranny does rear its head, it gets squashed pretty quickly. Getting back to the whole idea of suspension of disbelief, basically what we are suspending our disbelief for in Solarpunk stories is that belief that the majority of people are bad and only a minority of people are good. We're suspending our disbelief to then believe in the Solarpunk idea that a majority of people are good and a minority of people are always going to cause problems but are not necessarily bad. It's kind of diametrically opposed to the way that post-apocalyptic content, so media like movies and stories, has sort of like operated. It's opposed to that base axiom, or at least in my opinion, that's what some of the best Solarpunk stories do. So it forces the reader to speculate about what might happen if people choose not to be selfish or to value themselves and what they consider their property above everything else. So like, what would happen actually if good things happened? You know, like what happens if everything does turn out okay? What then? The Year Without Sunshine, I think it really, like, I think it does deserve the Nebula for forcing us to confront that sort of base assumption that most humans are terrible people.
Okay, that in a situation like that, it would all devolve into
Yeah.
like raids and disorder
Yeah, exactly.
and rioting and mobs and looting and
Yeah.
vandalism.
There's a book by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell, which is kind of the nonfiction version of this. And it actually documents like actual disasters that happened where people did come together and create community. And like there's far more stories of people doing that than of people, you know, looting or rioting or whatever, you know, like acting violent. Honestly, no reason. Why would they act violent, right?
I don't
Yeah.
know because they can, because it's fun. I don't know. I actually don't have
Because
an
it
answer
makes
to
a good
that.
story. It's
Hmm.
sensational. It, you know, like it gets people paying attention to it, but it might not necessarily be representative of the majority of instances.
Okay, everyone, that is everything we had to say about Naomi Kritzer's story, The Year Without Sunshine. Well, everything and then some. It's a great story. It's totally solar punk. I wish it would have said the words climate change, but it really is a super story. Definitely deserve the Nebula. Go read it if you haven't already. Ariel and I hope you enjoyed this special bonus episode. And until next time, you know the drill. Stay solar punk. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina de Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
Don't forget to support us on Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents.
Every little bit helps us keep bringing you discussions and interviews.
Until the next episode, keep dreaming.
And stay solarpunk.